All right, gang, so we're going to continue talking about our theory of externalities. We introduced it in the last lecture, so at this point you should understand the idea of what an externality is. You should be able to identify an external cost or an external benefit. We talked about market failure. When the market fails to be efficient, it fails to generate the socially optimal result. But we also understand that when we say that we have market failure, it doesn't mean the market's broken, right? It doesn't mean that the market can't function. The market is fully functioning. It's operating where supply equals demand, right? It's not generating any surplus, any shortage. It's just that the outcome of the market isn't the socially optimal outcome. So we're going to take it a step further by introducing the idea of Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. Now, Pigouvian taxes and subsidies are named after the economist who discussed this idea, and his last name is Pigou. So we're going to talk about Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies to address externalities. And to some degree, you're going to see that this is a theoretical discussion, but that will help us understand how we might be able to apply taxes and subsidies in the real world. So Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies. So let's start with an example of an external cost. And remember, another term for external cost is what? Negative externality, right? So a negative externality or external cost. So negative externality, external cost, spillover cost, all same concepts, right? Now, for ease of presentation, guys, we're going to make a change. So let's stick with our downward sloping demand curve. But now we're going to assume a horizontal supply curve. Now guys, I'm only doing that for the purpose of illustration because it will make it easier for you to understand how to draw the Pigouvian tax or subsidy. So let's make sure that we understand the implication when we say that we have a horizontal supply curve. Then we're basically making the assumption of constant cost, that we've got a constant marginal cost associated with production of this good. So it's just a simplifying assumption. Don't get too stressed about it. So graphically makes it a little bit cleaner. All right. So from this graph, guys, we know where the market's going to be operating. So the equation for the market equilibrium, as we know, it's supply equals demand. Very simple. So we know that the market's going to generate Q0 units exchanged, and P0 is going to be the market price. And let's call this the market for good X. Now, everyone agree, if good X did not involve an externality, this would be the market outcome, and it would also be efficient, right? Everyone agree? If there was no externality present, if production or consumption of good X didn't result in any spillover costs, we'd be done. This would be efficient. This would be the socially optimal output. This would be exactly how we want things to be. But as we've said, we've got an externality involved. So let's say, make it simple, just production of good X results in an externality. So we have an external cost. So production of good X results in an external cost. Now generally, when we think about marginal costs, do we normally think of marginal costs as increasing or decreasing? Increasing. So let's say that we can estimate this. So suppose we estimate the magnitude of the externality So we estimate the magnitude of the external cost, and even more specifically, we estimate a marginal external cost curve. So basically, understand what we're saying is that we've estimated the magnitude of the externality incrementally, right? So we've estimated incrementally. And so let's estimate that our marginal external cost is an increasing cost. So our marginal external cost curve looks like that. All right, everybody with me? Now again, do economists study this kind of stuff? Absolutely. Do people estimate this kind of thing? Yes. For every externality, would we at hand know the marginal external cost curve? Probably not. So understand this is a little bit of an abstraction, right? We're assuming that we now know what the marginal external cost curve looks like. All right. So I'm now going to add the marginal external cost curve to my graph. So we've got the marginal external cost that looks like this. So let's remind ourselves, for efficiency, or for the socially optimal outcome, what do we need to have happen? Well, let's remind ourselves. The market outcome is described by what equation? In Econ 217, we said we have a market equilibrium at what? Blank equals blank. Supply equals demand, right? But this ignores the externality. So it can't be efficient, right? Everyone agree? So the market outcome is generated by supply equals demand. And if there was no externality present, we'd be done, right? This would also be efficient. But in this case, we know we have an external cost. We know that supply equals demand, being the market equilibrium outcome, doesn't incorporate that. So for efficiency, we need to think about what? We've got a supply curve, and we want to add to it what? We want to add to it the marginal external cost, hence giving us a social supply curve. So we've generated a social supply curve. And then we want to set it equal to what? The demand curve. Right? Everything has to be some version of supply equals demand, right? So keep that in mind. Don't lose sight of what you already know. You know that when two lines intersect, that means something equals something, right? Everyone agree? All right. So basically what we're saying is we want to look at the social costs. And the social cost is going to be both the private marginal cost and the marginal external cost, right? And of course, an equilibrium requires something equals something. So we need that to be equal to demand. So everybody with me? Does that make sense? Intuitively? That makes sense, right? It's just a different version of supply equals demand, right? Different version of supply equals demand. But now what we want to do is generate this graphically. So, how would I generate this graphically? How would I create the social supply curve? How would I do that on this graph? Guys, put your phones away. So how would I do that?
Supply goes up.
Okay, I want to add together the supply curve and the marginal external cost curve. And I want to do that graphically, right? I want to do this geometrically. So it would make sense for me to start with my point on my supply curve and then add the marginal external cost, right? And I can start with this point, but now I need to add that. So now I have 2 points. See what I did? All I did is I took the marginal external cost curve, I measured it, and I added it on top of the supply curve, right? So I started with the supply curve and I added marginal external cost on top of it, right? Everybody with me? So that's going to give me something like this. I started with my supply curve, I added in the marginal external cost curve, so this gives me the social supply curve. Everybody with me? And do we understand, guys, that that social supply curve captures, look at what it captures. It captures private marginal cost. How does the social supply curve capture private marginal cost? Where does private marginal cost come from in this graph? The supply curve, right? The supply curve. And it captures the spillover cost because I added in the marginal external cost. Everybody with me? So does everyone understand how we got that blue social supply curve? We started with the supply curve and we shifted up by the amount of the marginal external cost curve. Okay. So now, guys, we can determine where we want to be. We want to be here. So let's call this point A, market. Point B is efficient. So we want to be at B. We really would rather have Q1 units instead of Q0 units. So we'd really rather have less resources allocated to this. And because there's an external cost, come back, there we go. Because there's an external cost, we really want that to be incorporated. So we really want price to be P1. Now guys, take a look for a second. What would be an equation that captures point B? It's got to be something equals something, right? Because two curves are intersecting. So how would you describe point B? How would you describe point B, guys?
MEC plus S equals B.
Say it again.
MEC plus S equals B.
Right. Everyone agree that point B, which is the intersection of two curves, has to be something equals something. And in this case, it's the social supply curve, which incorporates private marginal cost and external costs, is equal to the demand curve. So far, so good. Everybody with me? All right. Now, at this point, we know what? Do we have market failure? Do we have market failure? Everyone agree? We have market failure? So is the market here over allocating or under allocating? The market is over allocating, right? It's producing too much, allocating too many resources. We'd be better off. And is the market overpricing or underpricing? Underpricing. All right. So we haven't done anything to solve this. Everyone agree? We haven't done anything to address this. So now what we want to do is talk about using a Pigouvian tax or subsidy. All right? So we want to apply either a Pigouvian tax or subsidy. So guys, which do you think we want to apply here?
Tax.
Yeah, we want to use a tax. How do we know that we want to use a tax? Because it's a negative externality. Remember that taxes discourage behavior. Taxes discourage behavior. And obviously, we want to discourage something that creates a negative externality. All right? So we want to discourage this. If we want to discourage it, we want to tax it. What would happen if we subsidized it? Yeah, we get more of it, right? We don't want more, we want less. So it's very important that you understand intuitively when we would want to tax something and when we'd want to subsidize it. All right? So we want to subsidize it. I mean, rather tax it, not subsidize it. Sorry. So, guys, we're going to assume, just so that we're all kind of drawing similar graphs, that we apply taxes or subsidies, whichever one we're looking at, to the supplier. Now, I could subsidize or tax the demanders, but let's say that we're basically going to apply taxes and subsidies on the suppliers. We're going to collect taxes from the supplier in this case.
Does that say assume apply or assume supply?
Apply, we're going to apply taxes or subsidies to the supplier. They're the ones we're going to collect from them, okay? So we're going to collect the money from the supplier. All right? We're also going to make another simplifying assumption. We're going to assume that this is going to be a simple excise tax or subsidy. So I can make them somewhat sophisticated, but we're going to keep it simple. And we're going to keep it simple with a simple excise tax or excise subsidy, which means it's going to be constant per unit. So regardless of the fact that the external cost is going up, the marginal external cost is going up, we're just going to have the same tax on the first unit as the second unit, as the third unit, as the fourth. So all units are going to be taxed at the same amount. But it's not the only way to do it. But this is the easiest way to graph it. All right? So now, let's go back to our graph. So we've got the market for good X. And I would urge you to draw a second graph so we don't mess up our notes. They're going to be very hard to follow. And so we've got a downward sloping demand curve. And we're assuming constant cost. And we've got a marginal external cost curve that looks like this. So I want you to, without looking back at your notes, just to make sure that you're clear, find the market outcome and find the efficient, socially optimal outcome. So I'll pause here for a second and let you do that. So without looking back at your notes, make sure that you can find the market outcome and the socially efficient outcome. little bit too high. All right, so does everyone have something that looks like that? We want to be at Q1 and P1, but the market's operating at Q0 and P0. Is the market broken? No. It's reaching a market clearing equilibrium outcome. It's just not the one that is best for society because the external costs haven't been incorporated in decision making. All right? So, we know now that we need to impose a tax. And in this case, we're going to impose a Pigouvian tax. Now that sounds like a big fancy word, and it's really not. But a Pigouvian tax is the optimal tax that's necessary to have the market operating at the socially efficient level or socially optimal level. So the Pigouvian tax is really simple. It's simply the optimal tax that's necessary to have the market still functioning like the market, but operating at the socially optimal point. So the Pigouvian tax is one that solves, and I'm going to put that in quotes because solves kind of suggests like it goes away, the externality, but it doesn't solve the market failure that we see. All right, so are we ready to impose a Pigouvian tax? Now let's think about it. What do taxes do? If we were looking at a tax. So we looked at this once before. How did we impose a tax? Do you guys remember? How did we impose a tax? So remember, I've only got two axes, quantity and price, which are dollars, right? So a tax is a dollar amount, right? I've got to measure the tax vertically. Everyone agree? So a tax is going to be measured against the vertical axis. Why the vertical axis? Because it's a dollar figure. And I've only got two dimensions. So when I look at measuring a tax, I'm going to have to measure it in this direction. So my tax looks like that. So then after the tax, my supply curve has done what? After we've added the tax, my supply curve has done what? Shifted vertically, right? Which is also a shift to the left, but vertically because the tax is really just shifting it vertically upward. So the tax shifts supply vertically upward, which is also a supply decrease, right? We understand that. But it's important, if I ask you to show me the tax, you will need to show it to me as a vertical measure, right? So guys, back to our graph. We know where we want to be, right? We want to be right here, right? Where I just circled in blue. We want to be right there. Does that red supply curve exist in the market? Is the market able to operationalize decisions along that red supply curve? No. All it can do is manipulate people's behavior, and in this case, because of a tax. So we're going to use the tax to manipulate behavior. So let's impose a tax. Can we figure out the optimal tax? Can you find the optimal tax? We want that supply curve to shift upward, right? How high do we want that supply curve to shift upward? Till it goes right through that intersection, right? So what we really want is that supply curve to shift vertically upward. So this is our tax right here, the amount of our tax. So our tax causes us to go to S1. Our new supply curve is S1, which is equal to our original supply curve plus the tax. Everyone agree with that? Now, there's one more thing that we can point out about the Pigouvian tax. I want you to think about it geometrically. Think about how we got this point right here. How did we get to that point? We took the marginal external cost curve and we basically put it on top of the supply curve. We added them together. So what do you know about this distance right here and this distance right there? They have to be what? The same. Everyone agree? They have to be the same. I want to try to write that without making my graph too messy. So these heights in green must be the same. And we understand why they're the same, right? Because we took the marginal external cost curve and we added it, right? Because we took the marginal external cost and added it on top of the supply curve. So everyone agree that those two distances in green have to be the same. But that also implies something really important. Do we agree that this is the amount of the tax? That green height equals the size of the tax. So then what does that tell you? The Pigouvian tax, or the optimal tax, is a tax that is equal to what? Take a look at that for a second. By definition, the Pigouvian tax has to be a tax exactly equal to what? The marginal external cost at any point?
Where S social intersects with
Okay, where things intersect, but what would be an easier way of saying that? The Pigouvian, or the optimal tax, we just agreed is this right here.
Between S and S1.
Is the difference between S and S1, but that's just the measure of the tax. Let's be more precise.
Where S plus MEC equals D.
Where the two things intersect. All right, what's a cleaner way of saying that? We're talking around it. We're on the right track. At the, what was that, Patrick?
socially optimal.
At the socially optimal quantity. Everyone agree? So the Pigouvian tax is a tax that's exactly equal to the marginal external cost at Q1, which is the socially optimal or the efficient output level. So a Pigouvian tax says we need to tax an amount exactly equal to the marginal external cost at Q1, not the marginal external cost at Q0 or some other level. That would be too big, right? But the optimal tax to solve market failure is to tax people an amount equal to the marginal external cost that their behavior results in. So a Pigouvian tax is simply the optimal tax, the tax that addresses market failure. And we know, because of what we just did, that it has to be equal to the marginal external cost at Q1, the efficient level. So now let's take what we learned and look at the case of a marginal benefit. So, second example, let's say that good X results in an external benefit. So we've got the market for good X. Downward sloping demand curve, and we're just going to keep it simple. It doesn't really matter so much in this case, but let's look at a horizontal supply curve. So we're assuming constant cost. It just makes graphing the instrument a little easier. So again, we know that the market is going to operate at Q0 and P0. And once again, let's assume that we can measure the externality. And when we measure it, we can generate a marginal external benefit curve So when we generate that marginal external benefit curve, everybody with me, we're basically measuring the incremental spillover benefit. All right, so let's assume we can measure the external benefit. And when we think about marginal benefits, do we normally think about them as becoming marginally bigger or smaller? Do marginal benefit curves normally diminish or increase? Okay, so we normally think about marginal benefits diminishing, right? So let's think about a marginal external benefit curve that is diminishing. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a diminishing marginal external benefit curve like that. And if yours is linear, that's fine. It's not going to matter. Now, let's think about what we know. We've done this for external costs. Now we need to think about external benefits. So let's think about finding the socially optimal or the efficient point. So we want to find the socially optimal or efficient outcome. All right? But let's remind ourselves of what we know. the market is going to operate where? What's the equation that describes market equilibrium? Supply equals demand, right? And we understand, remember, that demand is comprised of the sum of the marginal benefits. So a demand curve is nothing more than the sum of the marginal benefits of the individuals who are consuming this good. What kind of marginal benefits? They're private marginal benefits, right? So that demand curve in our market captures the sum of the private marginal benefits and unfortunately ignores what? Yeah, it ignores the spillover benefits. Because people make decisions about private marginal benefits, right? Not taking into account spillover benefits to others. So when I plant that tree in my yard, I don't weigh into my equation, well, this is going to help clear the air, and that's good for everyone in the community, so I should pay more and plant more. I don't think that way. So now what do we need to do? We need to think about, for the socially optimal level, we want to think about the sum of the private marginal benefits in addition to what? The external benefits, right? So when we add those two together, the demand curve, right, the sum of the private marginal benefits and the spillover benefits, we get what we're going to call the social demand curve. Everyone with me? So I want to remember this right here is the demand curve. The demand curve is the sum of the private marginal benefits. That's how people make decisions. So for equilibrium, right, I need to have a point where two things are equal on the graph. I have to add to this, but let's take a second and generate our social demand curve. So everyone take a second and
The little red D, that's representing social demand curve.
nope, that's this right here, demand.
No, I'm asking above the sum of marginal benefits.
No, it's what I'm showing you, it's that demand curve right there, right? Private marginal benefits are what a demand curve is. You guys need to kind of intuitively understand a demand captures people's private marginal benefits. That's what I'm telling you, that a demand curve is the sum of people's private marginal benefits, their private willingness to pay, right? All right, so guys, can we generate a social demand curve? What do we need to add together to generate this social demand curve? I need to start with my demand curve and add what? My marginal external benefits. All right, so let's do that. So I want to take this distance right here and add it. And I want to take this distance right here and add it. Right, so we're generating this right here, the social demand curve. So I get something that kind of looks like that, right? There's a point at which marginal external benefits fall. So on a test, we want to try to be precise. It's a little hard on this. I'm not going to lie, it's a little hard on this projector thing. But you're going to want to measure accurately. All right. So everybody with me? We now have, this is D social, which equals
So does
the
it
demand
actually
curve. Hold on a second. Say again.
meet- Does it actually meet the demand?
At some point, yeah, because this curve kind of falls to zero, right? So those kind of line up, right? Does that make sense?
But that's what you wanted to look up on the test.
Is that what I wanted to look? I don't understand your question.
Because you said
I want you to be precise. What I'm saying is that if I have a piece of paper in front of me and a straight edge, I can draw this precisely, right? Right? I need to be precise when I'm measuring, so I want to make sure that this right here exactly equals that right there, right? And when I measure this right here, I need to make sure it equals that right there. And I need to do it precisely is what I'm saying. Or else, right? So don't just kind of randomly draw it. It needs to be precise. You know, it's just as precise as one can do it freehand. All right? So everybody with me? Now, where is our socially efficient point? Socially efficient, socially optimal, efficient point. Where do we want to be? Where what meets? Right there, right? So do you agree? This is a point where our social demand curve equals our supply curve. So let's come back down here for completeness. We need to see here that this has to be equal to the supply curve, right? I need something equals something. Demand equals supply. It has to be some version of demand equals supply. So do you agree that we want to be at Q1? So the socially optimal level is Q1. So in the last 30 seconds, guys, last 30 seconds, how would I get us there? Do I want to subsidize or do I want to tax? Subsidize. And remember, the only things that I can use are the black demand curve and the black supply curve, right? So what do I want to do? Subsidize. What does that do to the supply curve? Shifts it down. Do I know where I want to shift it to? I want to shift it to, let me use another color. I want to get to that point right there, right? That's the point on the demand curve that is efficient, right? So I want to subsidize to that level. So this is going to be S1, which is our old supply curve plus our subsidy. That one's a little bit harder to draw. But do you understand? I can only use supply and demand in the marketplace. Okay. So practice drawing this, guys, for homework, just in case we decide we're going to do some quiz on this. And of course, it will be heavily weighted on the test as well.